This is Event Horizon, and I'm your host, Mark Anthony Peterson. This is the podcast that takes a walk into the paranormal with a splash of conspiracy. This is the podcast that would be born if David Icke and the X-Files had a baby. Guys, welcome to episode 18, which is entitled My Mandela-Effect Hypothesis. Your blood is the key. I know. This is out there. But if you have followed along with all of the other episodes, you see where I'm about to go. Let's give you a quick recap for those of you who refuse to go back and look at some of the previous episodes. Episode 12, Swarm Intelligence versus Ancient Artificial Intelligence. I argue that God created a universal network, a swarm network, that we were all on, and that during that period we weren't carbon-based, but we were silicon-based, and that we could communicate with God because we were with God as a silicon-based being. We could experience superposition. We were everywhere with everything and could experience thought at the speeds faster than light. But then there was sin, and we were separated from the swarm and began to build our own intelligence, an ancient artificial intelligence that would connect all carbon-based beings. And that's what they built at the Tower of Babel. Their own network, an artificial intelligence that God saw was going to be a problem. So it had to be destroyed, and the minds of men had to be separated. Episode 13, I gave you my theory of where ghosts come from. We talked about CERN and the Hadron Collider and how they smash particles together to try to punch holes to open up doors to other universes, to other dimensions. I argued that's what your body does at the time of death. You see that flash of light. That's all of the memories you have stored in your consciousness colliding, opening a portal and pushing your essence into the next realm. When everything goes right, everything goes through the portal and into the next realm. But things don't always go right. There are times when you want to stay on this plane, either because something bad happened or you're not ready to go. And when a proton and an electron collide in the Hadron Collider, there's, for lack of a better term, shrapnel left behind. You have that happen in the spiritual world. Spiritual shrapnel left behind when there are instances when positive and negative energy collide to open that portal at the time of death. There's some residual energy left behind on this plane. Energy we call ghosts. And that's where I think it comes from. Listen to that episode because it walks you through how we get those things out of this plane and into the next realm. So those first two really set the stage of telling you where we were, who we are, and this separation of the universes and dimensions that we exist in. Episode 14 takes another step and says that man recognizes this. There are secret societies out there that recognize these truths, and they are looking to rebuild that ancient artificial intelligence. And that's what 5G is looking to do, to reactivate the artificial intelligence that's out there. You go, Mark, what are you talking about? In that episode, I argue that all the stuff you see on the planet, all these great pyramids, and these pyramidal structures aren't just there because they wanted to align them with the stars. They're there because the ancients were turning this planet into a supercomputer. That's how they were running the ancient technology that took over the minds of men and had them construct structures like the Tower of Babel and the pyramids we see around the planet. Ask yourself a simple question. Who in their right mind wakes up every day to build pyramids with the precision that we see on this planet? Yeah, they created their own network and captured the minds of men and built these great structures before those networks were destroyed and put out of commission. But I'm arguing they're rebuilding it, they're restarting it, and we're seeing the evidence of it in episode 14. Episode 15 builds on 14 and says one of the ways that man is trying to do that is to recreate the voice of God. The sound that started all matter into motion, the vibrations that kicked off the quantum worlds that exist, man is trying to recreate it. And that the sonic booms and horns and noises that we have heard and seen over the last 2 years all around the world are part of that experiment, part of this effort to relaunch the ancient artificial intelligence and to rival what God has built. If you look at some of the other episodes, you see that all of this is an orchestrated effort. When you look at the episode where I talk about 23andMe and the DNA companies and the reason they're going out and using questionable tactics to collect DNA in places like Africa, is because they're looking for something. They're looking for the DNA. They're looking for the DNA of the Messiah so they can create their own Messiah. Because this battle that's leading up to this episode is all about consciousness. And I've argued that consciousness for us is part of what we're made of. The soul, which I argue is captured in us through our DNA, because our DNA is a representation of a time machine. It represents all of who we were and all of who we will be in that DNA structure. We're made up of spirit, the spark that binds us to the God conscious that exists throughout all dimensions. So those three elements, consciousness, spark, and soul, make up our non-physical being. That being that existed before we got this carbon structure. And so those episodes give you the framework that build up to what I'm about to talk about tonight. My hypothesis on the Mandela effect. Why do we have it? And why is blood the key? I may have already given that part away. I've told you that your DNA is the key to your consciousness. Your key to the connection to the consciousness, and that your soul is part of that. I gave you Bible verses that show that when Cain and Abel fought, and when Cain killed Abel, the Bible talks about the bloods, plural, of Abel screamed out. All those future generations, the people who would be born after Abel, screamed out in anguish at his death. So the blood is the key to our consciousness, not our minds. Scientists are studying our minds and looking for consciousness in our minds, and they can't see the forest for the trees. Your mind doesn't have your consciousness. Your mind is an inhibitor. It's a harness. It keeps you from experiencing your consciousness. Your brain is a browser. It interprets what it feels and sees and what it can handle and renders that to you so you can understand it. You're getting millions of impulses per second, and it's limited down to just a handful of stimuli that it recreates in your head. That's not something that's giving you consciousness. That's something that's inhibiting your ability to experience consciousness. The ancients knew that you have to separate the mind from the body so that you could reconnect to your consciousness. That's why you meditate. That's why you dream. You dream to connect to the universal consciousness, not be awake. So that's why they'll never find it. They're looking for it in the wrong place. The blood is the key. If you're a minister or a priest or any of those guys, you know, because the whole ritual of blood at every mass is to share that consciousness with the congregation. Right? You're passing the blood in the body of Christ. Why is the blood so important? Because the blood contains the consciousness. Now let's dig into this episode. What are my key points? What are my summary points around this hypothesis for the Mandela effect? 1, qubits are the key to the Mandela effect. What's a qubit? A qubit is a quantum bit, and it is used in computing to create superposition. Superposition means you can be everywhere. Our current computers works on ones and zeros, and you use that to define just about everything that exists so that computer can interpret that rendering of ones and zeros into a message that you can understand through the interface. That has a natural limit, a linear limit to it that functions just like our carbon bodies. Right? As a carbon being, we function in a 1 or 0, on or off approach, and therefore we cannot experience superposition because we're either here or there, not in both places. But a qubit can function by being both a 1 and a 0 at the same time, which makes computing power almost limitless when you can assume that a qubit replaces a 1 and a 0 in the computing world. Now, what if I told you your soul functions just like a qubit and that it is governed by your DNA? You had to sit back and think about that one, right? Yeah, your soul functions like that qubit and therefore can experience superposition if it is not restrained by the physical self. And the DNA provides the tether that links you to every other being that's on your qubit string. When I say being, I mean life that's on your qubit string. And that could be across multiple dimensions or multiple universes. Because Einstein talked about this freaky physics that if you were to move a qubit in one dimension, it would move in the opposite direction in another dimension, no matter how far away that dimension was. So that connection is there and part of the fabric of being, the fabric of consciousness that preceded any creation of matter, and therefore is a part of you, if you believe your soul operates like a qubit. So qubits are connected via our understanding of the string theory, and all of the related qubits react no matter how far they are away in any universe or across any other multiverse. I think it's the reason why you believe you have guardian angels, because you feel all other life that's connected across your string. That's those related qubits, those qubits that share some part of the DNA energy that's charged in your soul. Remember in the previous episode, the spark, right? The spirit is what binds this soul, your energy, your DNA, and the consciousness of God in this dimension. Absent that spark, you don't really exist. Now keep that parked in the back of your mind, because it's going to play a critical part when we start really talking about what's happening in other parts of science and stem cell research. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that, because you're going to be wondering why fetal stem cells work so well and adult stem cells don't. Right? Yeah. Now you're starting to get it. The blood is the key, the DNA, the spark and the connection between giving us a celestial identity is the key. And scientists are starting to figure that out. They just haven't figured out that it's also the link to consciousness. So guess what, guys? When you have a qubit can be in its logical state, but it can be moved by what? Light. Let there be light. Where have we heard that? I think in the second verse of Genesis, right? And God said, let there be light. Well, how do you think the guys at CERN are stimulating particles to create some of these actions? Yes, with certain types of laser light. In fact, Princeton scientists have figured out ways to charge certain particles, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the show, to create reflective vacuum effects that make light move faster than we thought it could ever move. In fact, 300 times faster than the speed of light. Which means, yes, time travel, specifically past time travel, could be possible. But you're not telling me anything I don't know, because these are all fundamental characteristics of your soul. This is what the whole show was when we talked about the time before time. When you pull off these inhibitors, all things become possible. Because in this dimension, there's no matter. We're made up of nothing but vibrations, strings. The real universe is the dark universe. And God separated all of those things when he created the light. And that's what set all this into motion. That's why all of this stuff kind of makes sense to me. So CERN has figured this stuff out, and they're using the heavenly light, the collision of atoms, to punch holes into the universe, trying to find the multiverse and trying to discover other dimensions. And I make a distinction between dimensions and multiverse, because we think of dimensions as height, width, time, depth, right? Those 4 dimensions. But if string theory is to work, there needs to be 10 dimensions. And so there's some other ways of thinking about this universe that we haven't yet figured out, and they're trying to find it. I think God set that in motion with the light, and now CERN is trying to use it to punch holes in the universe to find out how it works. But when you punch a tiny hole with that light, as I just mentioned, you move the qubit out of its logical state. And when you move one qubit, what happens to all of the other qubits connected on the string? They move too. So if you punch a small hole and you hit a string and move a qubit, wouldn't everything else that's connected to that qubit also move? That's what I think causes the Mandela effect. You punch a small hole and you're going to change the reality of everyone connected on that string. They're going to remember the world as being slightly different than everyone else who was unaffected by that small punch, that small hole in this universe. Yeah. You keep punching holes, you're going to punch different strings, and different groups of qubits are going to get affected, leaving people with a mishmash of memories that don't quite sync up. I told you about in the last podcast, dimensional dream skipping, where I felt like in my dreams I was moving like the wheel on Wheel of Fortune through multiple versions of my life where slight changes were made to the room around me. Right? See, I have dreams where I come out of my body and I can walk around in the room. Up until a few years ago, nothing ever changed about what I saw when I was in that state versus what I call the non-waking state, right? When I'm not dreaming, when I'm conscious, or what we call conscious in the mainstream, those two matched up perfectly. Now they don't. When I go into that state, the room looks different. The outside is reversed. Trees are on the opposite side of my yard. That never happened before. Am I seeing these dimensions that are tied to my string through the eyes of other beings that share my same life path, but with small, subtle changes in them? And what if a hole is punched and some of their reality leaks into my universe? Those memories become my memories, and I see and think that things that happened in my universe are real. But they occurred in another universe, another dimensional universe that had previously been separated. That's what I think is happening. That's a pretty long summary, if you ask me. Okay, let's dig into this. Okay, in the last episode, I said, before time, consciousness operated like a quantum computer. Time didn't exist because we were superimposed and we occupied the exact same spot for past, present, and future. But God demanded that light force darkness from light, separated the two, and kicked off a quantum reaction. I think that quantum reaction launched a multiple quantum system that we call the multiverse. So when someone hacks one of the quantum systems, you're actually hacking one of the strings and causing all the qubits along that string to react. So the people, again, who are connected and tethered to those qubits feel the effects, and those who aren't don't feel the effects, and thus the Mandela effect. Right? Because we are made up of three components: that soul, which is our version of the time machine, our qubit plus the DNA, our spirit, the electromagnetic field, the brain that has the electromagnetic field that allows us to have that spark that binds the soul and God conscious in this universe. Is that all making sense to you? So in the time before time, consciousness was made up of original souls. Yes, 1-to-1, original souls. But after the intervention of light, our souls were then split across the multiverse. But the tether between those souls remained. Now, many of you may not see this the way I see it, but I had to go back to Genesis and reread it and think about it from this context. Was God really creating the first 7 days when we read Genesis, or was God creating the multiverse and the 10 dimensions that would govern the multiverse in Genesis? And when I thought about it from that perspective, the verses started to jump out at me. Verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. Verse 4, God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. Verse 5, God called the light day, and the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Verse 6, and God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. Let me reread that one. And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. Verse 7, so God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. And so God called the vault sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, and the second day. I want to start with verse 2. The Spirit of God hovering over the water. The first thing that kind of says to me is that consciousness is going to span all dimensions and all multiverses. The second thing is, why is God hovering just over the waters when there's darkness over the surface of the deep? The third thing I think about is, why is water so important to be emphasized so early in Genesis? 70% of the earth is water. Humans are made up of mostly water. The universe is teeming with water, and this makes sense because hydrogen is the most abundant element in the known universe. Again, back to my theory that we were made up of silicon, because silicon is the third most abundant element in the universe, hydrogen being number one. And if we're made up of mostly water, why wouldn't we have been made up of mostly silicon? I'm just reminding you of earlier podcasts. The earth did not always have water, though. The earth is a different type of planet than some of the gaseous planets that are in the solar system. And so that meant it went through an extreme heat period that would have vaporized all the water that existed on the planet, like we find on Mercury or Venus, right? The gaseous planets in this solar system have more water because of their structure and because the temperatures don't lead to that sort of evaporation. So how did Earth get the water that it has on it? Some have argued comets. I'm arguing that we are looking at the creation of multiple universes, multiple dimensions, and that water is the key to the separation of those dimensions. Water may be at its core the key to this time travel. In the year 2000, The Guardian reported that scientists at Princeton had discovered a way to get light to travel faster than 300,000 kilometers per second. In fact, they had found a way to increase its speed by 300 times the speed of light, using lasers to excite coal cadmium, which is a liquid metal, to create secondary ripples of light that amplified its speed. Kind of like throwing a rock into a pond, and those ripples amplify the speed of the initial waves. I think water can also be used and excited, or at least hydrogen, to create these types of vacuums that can allow for the speed of light to create the type of time travel that we see with qubits, the superposition that we have with qubits and the qubits that make up our soul. That was part of the time, before the dimensional world that we now live in. God had to set that into motion with the stimulation of light. Let there be light. After the light stimulated that quantum reaction, verse 3, he separated light from darkness, which is separating light matter from dark matter. Now, do you guys get that? Light matter has no mass. In our universe, light matter makes up less than 5% of the mass of the universe. Dark matter makes up the remaining 95% of the mass, and we can't find the dark matter. So basically, we are made of nothing but vibrations, and there's dark matter out there that's made up of 95% of real matter. God separated the two. Dark matter doesn't emit light or absorb light, which means it does not interact with the electromagnetic force that we experience in this dimension. So God separated those two out. Dark matter doesn't respond to any charges. And as I mentioned, it makes up the majority of the mass in this universe. So when God was separating light from dark, is the first step at creating the dimensions that we now experience, allowing for a universe where electromagnetic charges would respond and create forces like gravity and set into motion elements like time on the scale that we now understand. Now, if you buy that there's a string theory that connects all of these qubits, then there have to be 10 dimensions that have to exist to make the theory work, to make string theory work. So far, we only know of 4 dimensions: time, height, width, and length. I think I know what the remaining dimensions are, because these verses in Genesis are hinting at them. If God separated light from dark, and dark can't manage or deal with light or deal with any electrical charge, then I think the 5th dimension has to be spark. Has to be the spark that gives the binding of our soul, God consciousness, to this dimension. There has to be a spark. That has to be a dimensional element that binds the creation of non-mass related entities to this dimension. Otherwise, where's the glue? We have no mass. So you need the spark. You need electricity. That's the 5th dimension. I think there's an upside down dimension, a reflective dimension, because God put a vault to separate water from water. So there's a reflective dimension so that we see the opposite of who we are. I think there's a soul dimension because what we are has to return to somewhere when we create the portal at the time of death. There has to be a light matter dimension because God is telling you he's separating light from darkness. So light matter, sound, light, vibrations, that's another dimension. We don't sense it, we can't see it, but there are beings that can. I think Jesus, when he walked through walls and walked on water, showed us that there's an extra dimensional effect that we can't sense in this carbon body. That's the 8th dimension. The 9th dimension is anti-vibrations, dark matter, that is the antithesis of light matter. You can't accept a charge, it doesn't emit light, it doesn't absorb light. And then the 10th dimension is anti-soul. That's a dimension that is a bizarro world where everything is bizarro, exactly. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. But this is what I think was put into effect when we see God separating light from darkness and creating the dimensional effect. Verse 6, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. Verse 7, so God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above the vault. Verse 8, God called the vault sky. I don't think that sky is the sky that we think of. I think the sky is that imperceivable wall between each of the dimensions, and the water is the barrier that separates the two. So if there are multiverses that exist, this is the verse that defines the creation of that multiverse. And the sky is the separation of the waters above and the water below. I think it's kind of funny because in the movie Stargate, you see the beings walking through a water-like substance to get to other parts of the universe and other dimensions. And I think that's what's happening here. Verse 14, and God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times, days and years. Verse 15, and let them be lights in the vaults of the sky to give the light on earth, and it was so. Verse 16, God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set forth them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and separate light from darkness. Okay. By the time we get to verse 18, I think we're talking about what happened on earth. On earth, he's separating day from night to create the first day on earth. Prior to that, we're talking about the universe. God's putting stars out there to illuminate the universe and the multiple dimensions that he just created. Verse 18 is where he's talking about creating a day and night and a sun and a moon-like object or a second sun to govern the light and the darkness. So it's on day 4 that I believe God creates the official first day on earth. But everything prior to that is our multiverse and our multiple 10 or our many 10 dimensions that I just discussed. In the middle of all of that, I think the Garden of Eden is not on earth, but it's at the center of those 10 dimensions. And part of that tree of life and tree of knowledge is part of light, which is the tree of life, and the tree of knowledge is the dark matter. Yin and yang at the center of the dimensions, and that's what CERN is looking for when they're punching holes. They're looking for that tree of life. They're looking for the contours of that tree of life so they can understand the multiverse. Why? Because I think the multiverse, each dimension, each universe experiences each of those 10 dimensions differently. They're different effects. Think about that loaf of bread that I talk about in the episode, The Universe is a Loaf of Bread. If the universe started out as unleavened bread, flat bread, and then you introduce yeast, which is life, which is a comparison to human life. You put yeast in bread, it makes it rise and expand. You put life in a universe, it does the same thing. But it doesn't bake evenly. It bakes oddly. It bakes with a precision, but not equally across all parts of the loaf. And so I think the multiple universes, because they're part of that creation, don't rise at the same rate. And so they experience the 10 dimensions that I just discussed in very different ways. So time, height, width, length, electricity, reflection, soul, vibrations, anti-vibrations, and anti-soul could all have different weightings in those dimensions as you move further to the edge of the loaf. I know, crazy, right? And God essentially kicked all of this quantum system off when he said, "Let there be light." So let's talk about these qubits and how they're used in quantum computers so we make sure all of this is clear. So qubits, the subatomic particles, electron and protons, they are connected and can produce more processing power than any computer that we've thought about and dealt with today, because they give those binary bits the ability to have superposition and entanglement. They can be in every place, in every potential position, 0, 1, or both at the same time. So the amount of information and processing power a qubit-driven D-wave computer would have would be incredible compared to computers that operate with just zeros and ones, right? And those computers that use zeros and ones are only given more ability as the algorithms that drive those computers are updated and changed, but they have a finite ceiling, right? Our current carbon-based world, as I mentioned earlier, operates a lot like the 0 and 1 on and off linear time world. The quantum computer, or the qubit, functions like what our soul is in having superposition, and our consciousness, which our soul is connected via its DNA, and our ability to be in all places at all time with an ability to speak matter into existence. So the qubit represents numerous possible combinations of ones and zeros at the same time, giving that superposition researcher the ability to manipulate them using precision lasers. Right? Changing the state of one qubit instantly changes the state of other qubits in a predictable way, even if they're separated over long distances. So again, if you're buying what I'm selling, that we are essentially a quantum computer wrapped in a 1 and 0 carbon shell, we are living in a prison. That's what I argue when I talk to you in episode 12 about the swarm intelligence versus the artificial intelligence. We are quantum computers. And you feel some of that when you are dreaming and connected to the consciousness of the universe. Quantum computers, like the ones I'm describing with these qubits, can only exist in a space that is super cool, a super cold environment where the qubits can exist without noise that scientists call vibrations. You guys got that? Did you get that? So qubits in a quantum computer, for them to function predictably, for researchers, have to operate in a super cool environment where the qubits are not affected by vibrations. So when God spoke, "Let there be light," the energy of the universe kicked off this quantum process. All of what I described in Genesis. I'm hoping now that you see what I see when I reread those passages. So vibrations or life distorts logical qubits. And when you distort one, you distort all the other qubits that are entangled in that process. So, if we as individuals are connected via our qubits through our soul, and those soul qubits are spread throughout all dimensions and all universes, that tether that binds them together is never broken, no matter how far we're separated. So when the divine light, precision light that we talk of when we talk about the human manipulation of qubits, when that occurs, the logical state of a qubit changes, creating changes for all of the qubits, split across the universe, and creating new realities for everyone along that string. That experience, that binding, that ability to be superpositioned, again, is driven through your soul, which is charged with the DNA, which is communicated, that consciousness, via your blood. It gives you form, gives you identity. It gives you the touch of the lives that came before and after you. And that the brain is not the key to your consciousness, only the harness to your consciousness. It is the decoder, the browser, that takes those impulses, that stimuli that you feel throughout all aspects of your physical being and gives it some form or shape. But the blood is the key. Say, Mark, where do we see that? How do you understand that? I just look around and see every civilization, culture, myth, or mythology speak back to the blood. Blood is the energy because it contains that time continuum, the summation of who we are as a soul. So giving it and sacrificing it is like sacrificing a time continuum back to the gods. And that DNA blood combination is that source of that consciousness. Think about it. In the Bible, what were they doing? Sacrificing the lamb or the ram or any other beast, but the blood and the use of it was critical in the process. And now scientists are learning that same understanding as they delve deeper into stem cells and understanding its importance to giving life and consciousness to people on this plane. You're starting to get it now, right? Why does God demand the blood sacrifice? Why do we drink the blood of Christ in church? Why is it that people who've gotten organ transplants sometimes have been said to take on the characteristics of the donor? There are dozens of examples of people who start to say they feel and see the memories of the people who were the donors. Why does that occur? Because the brain's not the key. It's the DNA that is the lifeblood of your consciousness. Let's take this a little deeper. Stem cells can regenerate and repair damaged tissue. Stem cells from fetal tissue that has not been born is unspecialized, and they can give rise to specialized cells when placed next to those cells, right? It's like having Jesus touch you. He can heal you through touch by being in close proximity to you. Can repair and replace those cells. So cells from unborn babies are unspecialized, which means they don't have that spark of life and the consciousness in them. And so they are empty shells ready to be programmed with the consciousness of the cells next to them and can then start the repair and replacement process. These embryonic stem cells can proliferate for a year or more in a laboratory without differentiating, right? They can stay the same. But most adult stem cells cannot. Why is that? Because those cells have taken on the spark of life, the spark of consciousness, and so they have been programmed and tethered to other qubits across the multiverse. Scientists will never be able to figure out why there's that distinction. Otherwise, we should be able to take adult stem cells and perform the same types of healing with those cells for individuals that we would with embryonic stem cells. But they're not. Because the DNA, the soul, is the key to the stem cell differentiation. The DNA locks in the history and programs the future to sync with all other related qubits across the multiverse. And when that occurs, those stem cells can't be unprogrammed. Science is starting to figure that out, and that's why we're passing laws that make it okay to kill babies at any point we deem necessary to get access to those cells. They're almost like the God particle for this dimension at the point where we're linking that physics to the physical world, that quantum level to the physical world. They're the bridge. It's kind of interesting that if you can take an unspecialized cell and put it next to another cell, that it can recreate or repair those cells. Kind of reminds me of what my grandmother used to say. Birds of a feather flock together. Want to be good, hang out with good people. Want to be bad, hang out with bad people. And these cells kind of mimic that when they're unspecialized. But it seems kind of eerie that that's the key to understanding all of this stuff. The blood. But it's right there in the Bible in big bold print. And we read it as if it has no connection to the science that is driving our reality today. Go back and listen to some of the previous episodes on how the billionaires are planning to live forever. And you will see that half a dozen of these projects come from blood-related initiatives where young blood from really young people are being taken and given to these billionaires in order to restore or refresh who they are. I think the ancients always knew this because it's reflected in some of the religions. Jehovah's Witnesses don't want blood transfusions. Why? I think this is at the source of it. I've heard of instances with certain people who don't want vaccinations, storing their blood and embryonic fluid, going back and re-injecting some of that into their kids where they stored it after birth, and having the effects of some of the vaccines reversed after they injected them with that primordial blood, the pre-birth blood. It reprogrammed that living being. So what is CERN doing? As I mentioned, I think CERN is recreating that heavenly light, that spark that started existence, the quantum system that I spoke of there, creating that. The same kind of spark we see when life is formed in a woman. probably not coincidental that a lot of the secret societies worship the woman for that reason. So this CERN group, they are chasing this light and charging the state of qubits and changing reality. In fact, they're creating a time machine and reversing reality in some cases and creating the Mandela effect for groups of people who are impacted by their work. CERN is spinning those qubits, creating interdimensional entanglements that are changing reality for distinct strings and all the individuals who are on that string and that see the realities that were impacted. CERN may be looking for those illusory particles that could potentially show evidence of the multiverse, particles like gravitons. But I think they are swapping idiosyncrasies between worlds. And that's what the effect that we're feeling, but it's only on a limited level. Certain qubits. Guys, I've overstayed my welcome. And, I'm not a physicist, and I don't understand everything about quantum mechanics. I'm just a guy who is researching and looking at some of this stuff and trying to make it make sense. But every time I do dig a little deeper and go back and reread the Bible, it takes on a different meaning for me. Maybe I'm picking at the cracks and seeing what I want to see, but this is how it makes sense to me. If you want to continue the conversation, follow me at Event Horizon on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and let's continue this conversation. Follow me if you just want to get me some help, because maybe I do need to hydrate, and maybe that'll help me better understand the real reality that I might be missing. But thank you guys for tuning in. I enjoy sharing these thoughts with you and trying to peel back the onion of what may be a history that we've all experienced but can't remember. Till next time, guys. Peace.